Good morning. I'm Dr. Kimberly Monroe, Assistant Professor of History and Africana Studies in the Global Affairs Department here at Trinity, Washington University. I have the honor of introducing and moderating our panelists as they engage in conversations and themes related to rhythms, roots, and resistance in the Africana world. Each panelist this morning will present in the order that they are introduced, beginning with Dr. Natalie Hopkinson, Dr. Aisha Cort, and Dr. Msia Clark. Once each panelist presents, we will open the floor for question and answer, and please utilize the microphones to your left and right. Throughout the Africana world, Black people share a history of struggle and resistance against colonialism, racism, and white supremacy. Resistance has taken various forms, ranging from passive resistance to protest movements and direct military confrontations. Resistance efforts such as revolts, Maroonage, movement organizing, and the survival of African retentions demonstrates the strength, resilience, and hard work of African and Black people globally. It is also through this struggle against the many historical forces of oppression that we have been able to generate, preserve, and advance the well-being and development of African descendants globally. Music and culture serve as a form of resistance, a vessel for artistic and political freedom. Whether it be the blues, jazz, calypso, rumba, go-go, or hip hop, music has been directly related to the historical, economic, educational, and social growth, and as such, maintains a unique position in the literature of the world. Music means to question and protest inequality for groups that are largely marginalized in history. Music is a voice for activism and instills a sense of community, of working with others to change and improve. Moreover, music and culture throughout the African diaspora is not monolithic. It is clearly distinguished by an African-derived capacity to adapt to changing circumstances and draw from new sources of creative energy. Our first panelist, Dr. Natalie Hopkinson, is a writer, arts advocate, and associate professor in the Department of Communication, Culture, and Media Studies at Howard University. Previously, she has been staff editor, writer at the Washington Post, The Root, and Huffington Post. Her books, including A Mouth is Always Muzzled, Go-Go Live, and Deconstructing Tyrone, have been recognized by the Hurston Wright Legacy, PEN America, and the Independent Publishers Association. Her scholarship and activism as a co-founder of the Don't Mute DC movement influenced the 2020 legislation making go-go the official music of Washington, DC. Her cultural influence was recognized by organizations including the Capstone Group, the Mayor's Commission on Women and Poverty, and Race Research Action Council. In February of 2020, she was sworn in as a member of the District of Columbia Commission on the Arts and Humanities. Welcome, Dr. Hopkinson. Our second panelist, Dr. Aisha Cort, is a lecturer of Spanish at Howard University. She earned her BA in Spanish from Yale University and her MA and PhD in Spanish literature from Emory University. Her research focuses on Afro-Latinx and Latinx film, literature, and cultural production, with a specialization in Afro-Cuban cultural production. Her recent publications include The Lost Girl of Havana, A Tale of Afro-Cuban Diasporic Memory, and Rethinking Caliban, Shakespeare and Césaire in the Negro Metrage of Sergio Garral. Additionally, she is the guest editor of Black Cameras Close Up, Contemporary Cuban Cinema issue to be released fall of 2022. Welcome, Dr. Cort. Our third panelist, Dr. Msia Clark, is an associate professor in the Department of African Studies at Howard University. Her work focuses on representation of Pan-Africanism, African feminism, and the African identities in popular culture. Dr. Clark's research also explores women of African descent in cyber activism and their engagement in digital and social media spaces. She has published several articles, chapters, and books on hip hop in Africa and Black transnationalism. Dr. Clark is also a photographer, a podcaster, and is the host of the Hip Hop African. Trinity, please join me in welcoming our panelists for this session on rhythms, roots, and resistance in the Africana world. Dr. Hopkins.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So thank you so much for having this panel. A lot of times we're very siloed in universities. And so this is actually our first time meeting my colleagues. So thank you, Trinity, for bringing Howard faculty together. So my talk is on rhythm and resistance. And actually, I want to make sure I don't go over, so I'm going to keep track of my time. So my talk is on rhythm and resistance and talking about a project called Traditional Arts DC that I'm working on at Howard University. So you can go to the next slide. So one of the things that I think is important about the whole idea of roots, rhythm, and resistance is that these are questions that go to the very heart of our democracy. Whose voices are included, whose voices are excluded, what is art, what isn't art, what should be preserved, what should be cast away. And so many of these questions in the dominant narratives are driven by white supremacist structures. And so just for us to be here existing and sort of luxuriating our culture is a wonderful example of resistance. So a lot of the work, I've gotten really obsessed with maps recently. So preliminary definitions of music. So terms like world music versus classical music, again, follow this white supremacist framework. We have 7 continents, people argue about how many. So say we have 7 continents. Why are all the definitions sort of queued to one of them, which is Europe? And why are the expressions that come out of another continent, which is Africa, why are they suppressed and why are they suppressed? Again, these are questions about world supremacy. So the maps are going to come back a little bit later because we can look at the map globally, and then my recent work is really focused on the map here in DC across our 8 wards. So we can go to the next slide. So again, definitions. We love definitions of academics. Is it art? Is it noise? Should it be preserved or should it be thrown away? So can we play this clip here? This is a corner. Yeah, just a little bit. So this is the corner of 7th and Florida Avenue, Northwest. And raise your hand if you've been to this corner. Okay, great. It's one of the most magical corners of Washington, D.C. It's right where the Howard University Metro lets out. Keep walking down that street. 1995, this has been the scene. Here, if the clip were playing properly, you would see a postman taking his break, paying his cell phone bill. He sees a group of kids. And then he shows them how to do a dance, right? Chuck Brown is playing. Beautiful. Would you consider this art? I would consider it art, but that wasn't necessarily the case for, of course, this corner is in the 2001 area code, which is one of the fastest whitening area codes in the United States. So you can go to the next slide. So what happened at that corner is what has happened in many corners around the world. So that was where the Don't UDC movement started. So there was a gentrifier who decided that that music was not art, but noise, and demanded that the music be shut down. And sort of Don't UDC is the response to that, and has led to a lot of wonderful things, including go-go being named the official music of Washington, D.C. But I think in this talk, I really want to talk about how this struggle has been a global historic struggle, right? So another of our colleagues at Howard is J. Kerr Ritchie. He has a book called Rights of August 1st, where he talks about leading up to emancipation. He looks at what was happening. And so in this chapter, he talks about what was happening in Jamaica, right as the enslaved people were being emancipated. There's a white missionary who comes in, notices that all the soon-to-be freed enslaved people are having a ball, they're drumming, they're dancing, they're singing, and he says it was disrupting the neighborhood. So he goes over to this person, and this is what their response was. Basically, get out of my face. I have the right to play whatever music I want to play. And the fact that you can come in here and tell me to stop playing my music is only because you're white and I'm Black. But he was like, guess what? August 1st, we're free. And if you ever come into my yard again, I will split your skull, right? So I consider that the early roots of Don't You DC. This is like an earlier iteration of it. He was certain that once emancipation comes, he would not be defined in that way. And I'm really sad to say that people and our musical expression is still being defined as nuisances. So we can go to the next slide. So coming to Washington, DC in 1987, this is where a lot of my research on go-go music sort of picks up. There is a pandemic of drugs and violence in the city, and the city council, and these are all Black members of city council for the most part, they have decided that the problem is the music. And so they passed a curfew law saying that young people could not be in go-go music halls after a certain time. Now, if you were going to go see the ballet or the opera and you were 16, you were fine, But they specifically put this into law, and so they're literally criminalizing Black music and Black culture. So there was the poster to the left there was resistance to that as well. There were musical protests that happened led by Charles Stevenson Jr. And unfortunately, it prevailed, and that was the law of the land until 2020, when we were able to make go-go the official music of DC. That was the law in the District of Columbia, specifically criminalizing go-go music. So we can move to the next slide. So I'll talk more about Don't Mute DC at another point, but it basically, if you haven't heard about it, there were a lot of musical protests. People took over thousands of people took over corners. I and a community partner, Ronald Moten, did a change.org petition that got 80,000 signatures from 94 different countries around the world, defended that corner that we just saw at 7th and Florida Avenue. And so that allowed us to, so we were able to get the music put back on. So the magic is still continuing, but it really has activated a whole lot of activism, and we're really moving now toward institutionalizing the idea of never, ever muting DC. So that's my program at Howard University. We are creating the city's folk life and traditional arts program at Howard. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing there. So you can go to the next slide. So this is me. I think you heard a little bit about me. This was actually at one of our events that we did last year called The Color of Art, Ending Redlining in the Arts. So we can go to the next one. Next slide. So a lot of the work that we're doing with Traditional Arts DC, we're doing oral history work. And so one of the ways that you push back against erasure is that you bring our oral traditions or orality that is very innate in our culture and bring that into the official record. So in the West, the written word is the most lasting and powerful document. Like, we are in a reading and writing world. And in fact, many of us in the African diaspora, we come from oral traditions. And so oral histories are an intervention in bringing these oral traditions into traditional archives so that we can also be part of history. So I have this little clip. I don't know if my clips are playing right, from Miriam Makeba.
The conqueror writes history. They came, they conquered, and they wrote. Now, you don't expect people who came to invade us to write the truth about us. They will always write negative things about us. And they have to do that because they have to justify their invasion. We don't write our history. It has always been handed down to us orally by our elders. Of course, the white man came and he writes history. In fact, you don't know anything about any place until the white man gets there. Until the white man comes to any place, nothing lives. It's only when he comes and says, "Boof, I've discovered you, now you exist," which is ridiculous.
Okay, so we'll go to the next slide. So last year we did a series of oral history projects, loosely based around go-go music. So here I have a list of some of our partners. I think I have another slide that is partners in this work, but it's really important that we have institutional partners. When you're institutionalizing something, it can't just be at Howard or Trinity or any single place. So we work with the Kennedy Center, the Smithsonian Folklife. We work with the Office of Cable Television, Film, Music, and Entertainment, Humanities DC, and the DC Arts Commission to sort of organize a series of these oral histories. So we can move to the next one, next slide. So, and here are some of the partners who I mentioned. And the Go-Go Museum Cafe, which is another institution. My partner on the Don't Mute DC petition, Ronald Moten, he's the co-founder of that. So he was a partner on all of these projects last year, as well as some of these other folks. So as they say, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So that's part of the ethos of Traditional Arts DC. So you can move to the next slide. So we did 3 major events. The first one we celebrated the 50th anniversary of EU. Anybody familiar with Experience Unlimited and their song, The Butt? Show of hands, all right, okay, good. So amazingly, they turned 50, right? They were established in 1971, and can you believe that band is still going strong? So yes, yeah, so we did a reunion on Zoom, so we're in the middle of the pandemic. We basically broke the band into 5 eras, did group interviews, which we recorded, transcribed, those are going into the archives, and then we did a big party celebration because of course you guys celebrate. Then we did the Color of Art, which is, we talked about philanthropic redlining. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And then we did Go-Go Preservation Week at DC Public Library, which I believe is where I met your professor. And I'm so grateful that we did meet there. So we can move to the next slide. So this was the EU celebration. I think I'm running low on time, but fun was had. You know, all these people who hadn't seen each other in decades were able to come together. We filmed it, we celebrated. There was lots of music and tributes, and we shared excerpts of these oral histories that we recorded via Zoom. So we can move to the next slide. And we don't have to, yeah. So, and these are just some images of the celebration. And that was at the Panorama Room in Southeast DC, which is a classic go-go venue. And we live streamed the whole thing. So it's actually on Facebook. You can still see it there. So you can scroll to the next slide. And then we've got the Color of Art, which is where our map comes back in. We wanted to launch a conversation about philanthropic redlining in the arts. Since I was on the Arts Commission, I have found that, well, I could do a whole panel on that, but let's move forward. I'll just share the biggest finding from that panel. We can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I prepared this map where we mapped the funding for arts in the District of Columbia. And what we found is, you know, similar to that global map, all of the money went to the white areas. So you had areas like Ward 7 and Ward 8, which has most of the kids. You know, Ward 7 got 2.3% of the arts funding, you know, in the whole city. And so where the money goes directly maps to where white bodies are in the District of Columbia arts policy. Now, I don't understand that the idea that Black people or people who live in Black areas are less artistic than those that live in white areas, really, it challenges my belief system. And so there's definitely a lot of work that we need to do in writing this map. So we can, so one thing that I'll just sort of point out about this map, Ward 4 and Ward 6 they roughly have equal income level. So you know this is an issue of race when these are 2 wards that have roughly equal income levels. This is not a class issue. This is a race issue, because look at the disparities of what Ward 4, the arts, public arts investment that Ward 4 gets compared to what Ward 6 gets. So we can move on to the next slide. And then this is more scenes from this panel discussion, and we could keep going. Next slide. And this takes us to Go-Go Preservation Week, where, you know, again, we had done another bucket of oral histories that we did. We looked at club photographers, people who go to go-go clubs, and we did a series of oral histories with them. And Mr. G is one of them. He's a legendary go-go photographer, has been doing it since the 80s. One of those backdrops that he bought of Rare Essence, he'd been using since 1984. And so, you know, it was really significant to have him there taking pictures of everybody at the DC Public Library, and everybody was able to get free photos by Mr. G at this event. And then we also had other panel discussions and, you know, shared information for the community. So we'll move on to the next slide. So we also did, you know, one thing that's important about oral history is that it's not necessarily like training. Like most of us have these competencies in our communities. We all have storytellers that we know in our community that are great. So it's really not about teaching people how to tell stories, but just giving them some basic tools to be able to record them and to be able to enter into the official record via whether it's the DC Public Library or Moreland Spring Iron at Howard University. So we're just giving people the tools to be able to do that and to capture their own stories. And then we can move to the next. And also digital humanities training is another buzzword. So that's all part of what we're doing there. You can go to the next slide. And of course, peer-reviewed research. So I published an article in the Journal of American Folklore talking about the go-go mural, the go-go mural, Black Lives Matter mural, and live go-go activations, and how they were part of the historic Juneteenth protests during the presidential election. So then we can move on. And these are just some sources, just a further reading about you know, some of this line of research that we're doing. In closing, I just want to thank you all for allowing me to share some of the work that we're doing. And I'm looking forward to taking your questions and continuing the conversation about how you might be able to be involved as well. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me okay? All right, excellent. My name is Dr. Aisha Z. Cort, and today I'm going to be talking to you guys about Patria y Vida, erasing and racing revolutionary resistance in contemporary Afro-Cuba. I teach a course at Howard currently entitled Contemporary Afro-Cuban Cultural Expression, which explores the expression of Afro-Cuban identity and its illustration by Afro-Cuban writers and filmmakers within the context of the Cuban Revolution. It seeks to address two major questions. First, how does Afro-Cuban artistic expression of Afro-Cuban reality change from 1959 to the 1990s and 2000s? And second, how can we reread works from Afro-Cuban writers, filmmakers, and visual artists as sites of resistance within the context of the Cuban Revolution, in light of the ideological disconnects between revolution, racial discourse, and artistic expression and repression? We focus on various iterations of Afro-Cuban cultural expression and in turn, repression of that cultural and racial expression within the context of the Cuban Revolution. So in this short time, I'll just be highlighting a few of the trajectory and interconnected moments of racing and erasing resistance moments and efforts of the counter-revolutionary movements through the course of contemporary Cuban history. So throughout Cuban history, you have a series of what we call aperturas, which is openings in socio-cultural and political framework that allow for an expression and subsequent repression of racial identity and race-based agendas. It is cyclical and it's almost like clockwork. So each decade of the revolution offers up a new socio-historical or cultural context to interrogate. These chronological markers of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s are also of particular interest to the framework of this course on account of the pivotal historical events they coincide with. And I examine these decades through the artifacts of cultural production via the various available modes of narration: literature, film, visual art, and music. But in this course, before we even start talking about the revolution in 1959, we begin in the later part of the 19th century. We talk about the abolition of slavery in Cuba in 1886, the wars of independence from 1868 to 1878 and 1895, and the War of 1898. And then finally, we get to the period of the Republic. Why? Because it's during this period that Cuba began to work strategically to craft a national narrative that necessitated the erasure of racial identity and alliances to form a strong and cohesive national identity. This is the foundation of these cyclical moments of racing the Cuban experience, erasing racial experience, and the reactive and proactive resistance of both. This tradition carries and carries on well into the era of the Cuban Revolution. And I would argue that it distinctly marks it as these continued clashes between revolutionary discourse and racial discourse and the arts, where these tensions, censorship, and resistance often play out, highlight the incongruities between the tenets of the Cuban Revolution and the reality of a lived racialized subjectivity in the context of the revolution. So during the period of the Republic, as Black Cubans sought to establish themselves as an integral part of the newly independent Cuban nation, and during the Wars of Independence, many Black and mulatto men joined the army in hopes of raising their social status and potentially gaining access to the rights of Cuban citizenship. And despite the fact that Blacks and mulattoes represented 1/3 of the population and Black and mulatto men made up 50% of the armies of independence, when the nation was carved out and the narratives of nation scripted, many Black and mulatto veterans found themselves on the outside looking in. The socio-political upheaval of the Wars of Independence, though, did lead to openings that allowed for the creation of organizations and societal structures that were representative of continued Black resistance during the Republican period. A prominent Black press, influential sociedades de color, which is societies of color, and also the founding of the ill-fated Partido Independiente de Color, which is an independent party of color I'll be referring to as the PIC. That being said, many of these openings and spaces for Black expression and gathering were systematically repressed over the course of the Republican period. For example, the PIC that was founded in 1908 by Black and mulatto veterans of the Wars of Independence that found themselves excluded from the majority Liberal Party, subsequently were subject to the effects of the Monroe Amendment, which was passed in 1910. This amendment prohibited political parties based on race or class in Cuba. This in effect disbanded and made the PIC illegal, which at the time was the only political party for Black men in the Western Hemisphere. So building on this legislative momentum, the founders of the PIC, along with their party members and many innocent bystanders, were slaughtered in the massacre of 1912, which was reframed by the Cuban government as a result of a necessary and successful quelling of an impending race war. I'm gonna fast forward just in the interest of time. Not that that wasn't important, but something to think about. The period from 1959 to 1989 is full of moments of Afro-Cuban resistance that are either in direct response to repression or yield expression as a result of their expression. Critical events such as the Black Manifiesto plot, the Padilla Affair, and more shape the context within which Afro-Cuban artists were able to create and interrogate their reality. In 1961, at the beginning of the revolution and within the context around debates of the relationship between race, art, and revolution, Fidel Castro met with intellectuals and launched a phrase that would define Cuban political and cultural policy for years to come. Dentro de la revolución todo, contra la revolución nada. That is, within the revolution, everything. Against the revolution, nothing. So in this speech and warning, Castro not only laid the groundwork for the cultural aesthetics of the revolution, but also set the precedent for future conflicts, which would inevitably arise between Cuban Revolution, racial expression, and artistic expression. But even as censorship increased during the 60s and 70s, resistance lived on via the arts. For example, in his 1968 film, Cofea Arrábiga, Nicolás Guillén-Landrian includes a scene towards the middle of the film. It is very frantic, it's full of strobing symbology, but it culminates at the end with this kind of slowed down movement of still shots of a Black woman sitting in front of her mirror, setting her hair in rollers. This seemingly mundane act, although subtle, is fully charged. Afro-Cuban women who were considered revolutionary straightened their naturally tightly curled hair, either with hot irons or chemical relaxers. Thus, the deliberately drawn out scene of the Black woman with straightened hair, meticulously setting her hair with rollers is a profound one. At the time in revolutionary Cuba, natural Black hairstyles such as afros, cornrows, locks, braids were outlawed and labeled as counter-revolutionary and divisive until a fortuitous visit to the island by Angela Davis in 1972. Conversely, for Black Americans who visited the island wearing natural hairstyles, their hair was interpreted as radical, while Afro-Cubans who sought to employ the same hairstyles were deemed again divisive and counter-revolutionary. So conversely, Afro-Cubans who wore their natural hair straightened or chemically processed were seen as revolutionary, while I mixed that up. what I just said. Black Americans who did the same were viewed as conforming to ideals of white standards of beauty. The combative associated properties ascribed to natural hair in the context of the revolution are at once intriguing and confusing. But in this intimate scene, Landrian posits that the very elements that constitute Blackness, things like hair, have been altered and revolutionized. Landrian challenges the authenticity and revolutionary value of straightened hair and also reevaluates the stigma and negative connotations of the natural characteristics of Black hair. But for this and other subtle and not so subtle critiques and questionings present in this film, Guillen Landrian began an almost 20-year cycle of repeated jailing and torture in revolutionary Cuba. Still in 1968, the Cuban government falsely labeled Nancy Morejon, along with Rogelio Martinez Fure, Nicolás Guillen Landrian again, Sara Gomez, Pedro Perez Sarduy, Manuel Granados, and other Black individuals and intellectuals as Black troublemakers. This group of Black intellectuals was accused of hatching a plot to overthrow the government after they met with the then Minister of Education, José Llanusa Gómez, to discuss a position paper on race and culture in Cuba that they prepared for the ongoing World Cultural Congress in January of 1968. In the meeting, the contributors of the essay were encouraged to speak freely with Gómez about their concerns regarding race in Cuba under the false impression that their opinions would be incorporated into the Congress. But midway through the meeting, Gómez made it clear that voicing such concerns to an international audience at the Congress would be nothing less than sedition. And thus, after meeting with Gómez, the position paper was quickly labeled as the Black Manifiesto Plot, and its organizing members were dispersed. A number of group members were either sent to prison, to UMAP camps, which are work camps, or rehabilitated. During this time, in the 70s and 60s, other artists such as Sara Gomez, in her only feature-length film before her untimely death, De Cierta Manera, critiques the plausibility of not only the expectations of the Cuban Revolution, but also that of the utopic expectations of the Cuban people. She brings the margins to the center by providing voice and image to subaltern and marginalized subjects. In order to do so, she underlines the reality of those who remain marginalized in and in spite of the revolution, those who progress have left behind. Additionally, other filmmakers such as Sergio Giral use the positionality of the past to critique contemporary 1970s Cuba. And I would argue that the most radical social commentary on contemporary reality of Afro-Cubans in the 1970s lies within the Negrometraje trilogy of Sergio Giral. Negrometraje is a derogatory yet popular term that euphemistically translates as Black feature film and more realistically in the 1970s as nigger film. This is the term that applied to the 1970 film of Sergio Giral and others whose cinematic work dealt with themes of slavery and slave rebellion in 19th century Cuba. This term was used as opposed to the general term of largometraje, which translates as feature film that's applied to almost all other films. What's interesting also about the 1970s is that at this time in Cuba, its internationalist policies towards African and Asian nations such as China and Angola is in direct opposition to what's going on internally. There's a influx of politically important and considerable group of Black Americans and their Black power ideologies into the island, all of which provided Afro-Cubans with a rich store of models and possibilities for representation of Afro-Cuban identity. But as Cuba extended itself in solidarity to Black and brown nations of the global South, internally, the treatment of Afro-Cubans was in direct opposition to Cuban external policies. By focusing on the cultivation of a strong, cohesive national identity, again in the revolutionary period, just as we saw in the Republican period, Fidel Castro was able to veil voices and collectives based on alternative forms of solidarity. By labeling these groups as divisive and anti-revolutionary, Castro was able to silence and crush internally the possibility of the immersion of a Cuban identity that identified with Blackness. For example, Black social clubs and mutual aid societies were forced to close, and Afro-Cuban-based religions had to register with the police. The adoption of this policy of internationalism in the later half of the 1960s and into the 1970s also allowed Castro's regime to effectively externalize the discussion of race. In effect, the spotlight was placed on the US and other countries that were publicly plagued by racial problems, while detracting attention from Cuba's own contradictions. As a result, Castro went so far as to declare in 1975 that Cuba was a, quote, African Latin nation. that embrace both the Black population and the cultural heritage of the former slaves. Most recently, we have seen the release of the protest song Patria y Vida in 2021, which continues the work of the Movimiento San Isidro and the 11 de Julio protests of 2021. This is a culmination of Black and mulatto artists calling for change, resisting the increasing censorial measures of the current regime and being met with very severe repressions. So what I would like to end with is the second verse of this song. It did win a Latin Grammy, but there's more behind it. I'll do it first in Spanish and then in English. Somos artistas, somos sensibilidad. La historia verdadera, no la mal contada. Somos la dignidad de un pueblo entero pisoteada a punta de pistola y de palabras que aún son nada. No más mentira, mi pueblo pide libertad, no más doctrinas. Ya no gritemos patria o muerte, sino patria y vida. Y empezar a construir lo que soñamos, lo que destruyeron con sus manos, que nos siga corriendo la sangre por querer pensar diferente. ¿Quién le dijo que Cuba es de ustedes, si mi Cuba es de toda mi gente? We are artists, we are sensibility, the true story, not the one that's poorly told. We are the dignity of an entire people trampled on, at gunpoint and with words that are still worthless. No more lies, my people call for freedom. My people for freedom, no more doctrines. We no longer shout homeland or death, but homeland and life. And start building what we've dreamed of, what they destroyed with their hands. Stop the bloodshed for wanting to think differently. Who told you that Cuba is yours if my Cuba belongs to all my people? The trials for the protests that occurred on the 11th of July of 2021 are still ongoing. People are still jailed while others have disappeared. Michael Osorbo, who is one of the artists on the song Patria y Vida, that I just read the lyrics for, who was living in Cuba at the time, was jailed as well, and he has been jailed since May of 2021. Again, these cyclical moments of erasing Cuban nation as an experience that's mulatto, mulates, mestiza, or even calling Cuba externally an Afro-Latin nation, erasing racial experience, and then the reactive and proactive resistance movements that occur in the arts is ongoing. This is not just something from the 60s and 70s. So thank you. Just putting time's up.
Right, thank you. I'm gonna reiterate the thank you in terms of bringing us together. I do want to mention before I start that for the past, I guess, year or so, there's been a committee at Howard to establish or propose a new hip hop studies minor. And it's coming through COAS, the College of Arts and Sciences. And again, speaking to the silos that exist at many universities, being on the committee, one of the struggles has been finding faculty on campus that are teaching courses on hip hop or that are teaching courses that could kind of go into the course scheme. It's going to go into the interdisciplinary program. So we've been looking at courses across the campus. So the struggle has been the School of C, Fine Arts, the business school, trying to see, what are the courses our students who are outside of that school. So I'm so excited to meet you guys and to kind of after this talk more, because I think, again, until you really are put in touch with people, you don't really know who's doing what on a campus. People are doing great work and you're just not even aware of the work that they're doing, but they're not directly in your department or a department that's closely connected to yours. So I'm really excited to hear about that. And of course, Howard's hip hop studies minor really is several years in the making. You could even argue since the days of the first hip hop studies conference in '91, hip hop is long overdue. We debated about whether doing a minor or a major, but it's long overdue. And I want to acknowledge Dr. Wright because he was involved in creating the first hip hop class in the Department of Afro-American Studies. And it is now the most popular hip hop course at Howard. I think they enrolled about 100 students every spring. Dr. Carr teaches that class now. But yeah, you were involved in the first, first course. So, one of the things that, I think a lot of us who teach about hip hop, write about hip hop, started off as kind of fans of hip hop, started off in the culture. And so I go to the next slide. Want to look at the kind of timeline in terms of looking at hip hop in Africa. So for myself, having grown up in Cleveland, Ohio, not really known for its hip hop, but having grown up in Cleveland, Ohio, being from Tanzania originally, going back to Tanzania in the mid-90s and really kind of discovering this hip hop scene that had really kind of exploded, and not being there during the kind of genesis of it. So as I kind of went into academia, realized I really wanted to do, and I realized you could study hip hop and write about hip hop, and like it was a thing in academia. Hip hop studies scholars, early scholars like Trisha Rose were really, influential for people like myself. And so when we look at the timeline of hip hop in Africa, you really have kind of the 70s and 80s really being the time in which hip hop kind of comes across the Atlantic into Africa. Of course, we have to acknowledge hip hop's African roots in storytelling, kind of looking at hip hop's old school drum beats and similarities to African drum beats, the role of the MC, the call and response in hip hop culture. So it has those African origins. So hip hop kind of comes back across the Atlantic. The first two countries it really develops in are Senegal and South Africa, and they still have two of the largest hip hop scenes in Africa. Senegal is extremely proud of its hip hop culture. And so you've got those two countries kind of really at the forefront of hip hop in Africa, both really, again, 70s and 80s South Africa, that's apartheid South Africa. So you can't be an MC in South Africa under apartheid and not be political and not have any political content. And so the artists there were rapping about, or against apartheid. In Senegal, you also had a lot of political content. So the 1990s, you have hip hop spreading throughout the rest of Africa. A lot of it is still based on imitation. So you do have a whole lot of kind of imitation going on. So when I was there in the when I first kind of went back for a long period of time, there was still a lot of imitation, but you do see people increasingly rapping more about their local conditions, rapping in local languages. So that process kind of begins to happen across Africa. And then 2010s, you have artists kind of really mastering social media spaces and resources. Next. So in looking at Africa in the 1980s and 90s, specifically as hip hop spreads across the continent, there are several reasons why youth in Africa are so attracted to hip hop culture. So we know hip hop is a predominantly urban culture. It emerged in South Bronx, it emerged in, throughout the boroughs of New York City, and that's where it lands in Africa. So there's really no African city that does not have a hip hop scene. Some of them are smaller, some of them are larger, but Africa is going through a rapid period of urbanization. So you've got a lot of people moving from the villages into the cities looking for work. A lot of them are youth. So you've got large youth populations. In many countries in Africa, the population is over 50% youth. Many of them getting to the cities can't find jobs, living in overcrowded conditions, much like the inner city in the United States, finding poverty, inadequate housing, schools that are broken, school systems that don't work. And so infrastructures that are not, again, overcrowded housing, infrastructures that are not fit for, for them to thrive. And then leaders that have failed them. Many governments that are, corrupt, leaders that are not doing what they've promised. And so they're hearing this music coming in, talking about these very same things. So if we look at kind of the early hip hop songs about life in the South Bronx, life in New York, life in burnt out tenement buildings, many African youth are able to identify with that. Next slide. And so when you look at the similarities, you do have, again, the urban experience. So hip hop grew in urban Africa. So where you have other forms of African music, you really have a strong connection in many cases to the village. You have a strong connection to traditional music. In the case of hip hop, is predominantly an urban music, an urban form. So my research has traditionally kind of really focused on, you know, hip hop as social commentary, and is increasingly now going into looking at specifically at South Africa. I've been really fascinated by looking at some of the similarities and parallels between South Africa and the United States. And so when you look at, for example, South Africa, you have hip hop coming to Cape Town first in South Africa, into the colored townships of South Africa. So the picture on the top is from New York, Brooklyn. The picture on the bottom is from Cape Town. So you've got, in the case of South Africa, colored South Africans being forced to live in these townships, again, overcrowded, unsanitary conditions, schools are inadequate, can't find jobs. And so very similar to the life that is being lived by many Black and brown youth in New York City. So you've got residential segregation. In South Africa, it was legal residential segregation. While in the US, we had kind of legally abolished segregation, but we know that it was still there. And then you also have, again, these, you know, inner city experiences that are shared. Next slide. So one of the other things I really am fascinated about is the fact that in South Africa, hip hop first comes to Cape Town. It's a good decade or more before hip hop really takes off throughout South Africa, where you also have Black South Africans participating in hip hop. So one of the questions that I'm in, you know, my kind of future research I'm looking at is, what was it that drew colored South Africans specifically to hip hop first? So we know that colored populations in South Africa are predominantly urban populations. But when we also look at the relationships and the similarities in terms of identity, so colored South Africans are pretty much anyone who is considered mixed race, someone who is not necessarily able to identify a specific ethnic group, it doesn't belong to a specific ethnic group. They're not Zulu or Xhosa or one of the other ethnic groups. And so it's very interesting when you kind of look at the experiences of people of African descent here. So in the US, we have the one drop rule. One drop, you're Black. It doesn't matter what your skin complexion is, your hair texture. Well, it's different in South Africa. So in South Africa, you know, the creation and differentiation of people based on kind of this mixed race category means that you have a whole population of people that span the spectrum in terms of complexion, because I've met people who were my skin complexion who considered themselves to be colored. So you're someone who is living in Cape Town in one of the townships, and you're watching these hip hop videos, seeing these images of African Americans who are also spanning the spectrum in terms of complexion, and immediately visually there's an identification. You also have a shared trauma. Both colored South Africans and African Americans are populations that were created out of subjugation and the violent assault of one group of people by another group of people. Colored South Africans really, you know, as a population emerged because of white South Africans basically raping First Nation communities in South Africa. So that's the genesis of colored populations. And we also know what happened here during slavery. The third kind of similarity is language, in the sense that both populations are given this language of their oppressor and told that, you know, you must master this language, and true development and civilization is to master this language. And in both cases, they took the language and twisted it into something that more resembled themselves. So in the case of African Americans, that's African American vernacular English. In the case of colored South Africans, they took Afrikaans and created COPS. COPS was recently, in the last couple of months, finally recognized as an official language variation in South Africa. Next slide, sorry. So when we look at hip hop as social commentary, kind of going back to but a lot of my research has been based on, we see on the continent, hip hop being used as a form of protesting specific living conditions, protesting how the people are, living in a certain way, how the people are being oppressed. It's commentary on the specific industries. It's a commentary on what the government is doing. And it's also really, in some cases, about activism, speaking to the people, calling for action. So the image in the background is a Senegalese hip hop group, Kirgi. They were active in the Yanamar movement, which was a movement in Senegal where hip hop artists and activists kind of came together and really took to the streets, protested the government, not just protested, they wrote songs of protest, but they also managed to register over 300,000 people to vote. And they got the president, who wasn't supposed to run for a third term, ran for a third term. They were able to get him voted out of office. And that was all behind the Yanamar movement, through which hip hop artists in the hip hop community played an integral role in that. And then also, in North Africa, we had Arab Spring. In the Arab Spring, you had not only hip hop MCs, but you also had graffiti artists that played a significant role in what took place there. Next slide. So the relationship between the artist and the state throughout Africa has always been very kind of precarious. And so again, when we look at South Africa, hip hop coming up during the apartheid era, it was banned. Our apartheid government banned hip hop in South Africa. Yet still you had colored South Africans using it as a form of protest. Today, you still have throughout the continent, artists using it to protest the state. Now, like anywhere, you have something that is been commodified, and people who are participating in that commodified genre are wanting to cooperate, because cooperate means bringing in more income. So you do have kind of two different ways in which artists are engaging with the state. In some cases, they're cooperating and they're doing, they're singing at campaign rallies, and they're wearing the shirts of the different candidates. They're getting sponsorship deals. They're getting played on the radio more often. They're getting more funds, more money, more opportunities. They have good relationships with the government. At the other end are those that challenge the government. And the reaction varies depending on the government. In Senegal, the government, isn't a fan of the hip hop artists, because hip hop artists really hold them accountable. But you also have kind of more repressive governments, like in Angola, where some of the hip hop artists have actually been put in jail, and kind of there've been more repressive tactics. So in challenging the government, there is greater censorship of your music. You don't get on the radio as much. You don't get as much revenue. You're definitely watched more, and you have to depend on alternative sources for your music to be heard. YouTube, other social media platforms are what many of these artists depend on for their music to get out. And many of their performances are often outside of the country. So many of these artists perform in Europe, some of them perform in the United States, but their relationship with the state is very different. The next. So some of the topics that the artists are, kind of deal with throughout the continent, again, it varies. Migration is a huge one. In West Africa, you have Africans who are, either taking the boats. Every once in a while you hear about a boat that will have capsized, and either people who have been rescued or lost at sea. So you have, people talking about that. People who take the route across the Sahara Desert, which is considered one of the most dangerous migration routes in the world. You also have people going from East Africa down into South Africa, and then in South Africa, some of them trying to stow away on ships. So the migration struggle is also something that is talked about. Corruption, of course, gender-based violence is something that's talked about, especially in South Africa, which is where there's a huge issue. LGBTQ+, I don't want to kind of make it seem like it's a huge thing that people are really kind of champions for. I mean, Africa, I think if that was the case, we wouldn't have, it wouldn't be such so many governments that are jailing people and killing people. But you do have some artists that are vocal. So one of the artists, Falls the Bad Guy, who's a Nigerian artist, he has been probably one of the more vocal artists out of Nigeria. So Nigeria is probably more known for its Afrobeats music, the party music. And so Falls is probably one of the more popular hip hop artists out of Nigeria. This song, This Is Nigeria, was banned in Nigeria. He's also been outspoken for LGBTQ plus rights. He was also very involved in the NSARS movement. So I'm just gonna play a couple of,
This is Nigeria. Look how I'm living now. Look how I'm living now. Everybody be criminal. This is Nigeria. Look how we living now. Look what we eating now. Everybody be criminal. This is Nigeria. Just because I'm on TV now. Person who don't get work is checking to see if my watch is original. This is Nigeria. Where that Madam Philomena. Money vanish for your office, 36 million, you tossing an animal. This is Nigeria. Never ending recession. When looters and killers and stealers are still contesting.
So in the video, I mean, there's several different things he's dealing with. The Nigerian government felt he was making the country look bad. And that's why they banned the video, I mean, which of course made it much more popular. But of course, it is also a video that he was influenced by Childish Gambino's video. And so that's where it comes from. That's where he was inspired to do it. So the other clip is an interview we did with Gigi Lemaine. She's a South African artist who Dr. Monroe knows very well. And she's talking about being a woman in hip hop, and really kind of talks about it from a South African perspective, but also acknowledges that being a woman in hip hop is universally a challenge. So we can play that, hopefully it plays.
But nothing is as brutal as the conversation around feminism in Africa, because it's something where, you know, there is culture and how a young Zulu woman, a young Sotho woman, a young Xhosa woman is expected to behave. And then there is almost this, wow, okay, there's this girl in a very male-dominated industry, you know, like the United States, a very male-dominated industry, and she's saying all sorts of things. Some of these things are provocative, some of these things are very demanding, and that's not how women, you know, behave. So it's often a very isolated decision you take. It's a lot of agency that you take when you decide to even become a female rapper. The idea of a female rapper is already politicized in itself because it's something that's not expected.
All right. So again, you know, really looking at the idea of women getting involved in hip hop, just the decision to get into hip hop as an MC is a huge decision. It's already kind of like, you know, you're already in many ways challenging patriarchy by simply taking up space there. You know, you're seeing not only in Africa, but throughout the US, more and more women challenging, well, you know, we know there's a lot of misogyny in hip hop, but challenging even some of the earlier, you know, ideas that women espouse. So the idea of a quote unquote femc, or the idea of the first lady. So many women coming through all male crews early on in the, you know, 90s. And so now you're having more women coming, you know, onto the scene independently and not wanting to be acknowledged as the queen of, or as the only woman in the all male crew, or as a femc, but wanting to be recognized as MCs, period, without any kind of qualification to it. The next slide.
But nothing.
Yeah, okay. So in terms of looking at, you know, again, wanting to acknowledge hip hop's African roots, but also placing it within kind of an overall cycle of Black music. So when we look at, you know, I was doing a lot of my research on the continent, you would hear, you know, sometimes older people say that hip hop was this American thing, that the youth were just, you know, trying to be American, forgetting that Fela Afrobeat music heavily influenced by funk music from LA. So you can hear the funk in Afrobeat. You know, High Life from Ghana, heavily influenced by diasporan music. Then you've got, you know, people like Mary Makeba and Hugh Masekela in South Africa, jazz musicians, also influenced by the jazz music scene. So the whole Cape Town jazz scene definitely influenced by the jazz scene in the diaspora. So the idea that because kind of contemporary hip hop has its roots in the United States, it can't also be African. So when you're, now talking to artists who are very much aware of the history of hip hop, and breakdance, for example, is huge in Uganda, right? There's a huge breakdance scene in Uganda. And I was recently reading an article where they were interviewing some of the breakdancers, and they were saying that we have developed and refined breakdancing and localized it to such an extent that breakdancing is now part of Ugandan culture. It is not just something that is imported, that it is Ugandan. It has become Ugandan. And so when you kind of are looking at the way hip hop is evolved, you've got graffiti festivals like Festigraph in Senegal and the Charlie Wote Festival in Ghana. You have all of these ways in which youth on the continent have taken hip hop and kind of taken the ball back and, shaped it and developed it on their own local terms. And that's also kind of having an influence. And so kind of looking at that, in the early 2000s, you had this emergence of African MCs in the US. So you had artists like Blitz the Ambassador, Manifest, Kanon, some of these artists who would be coming into the United States as students during that time and would use that time period to really develop their art. Some of them, like Manifest, went back to Ghana and became hugely successful. Blitz the Ambassador stayed here, made a huge career for himself here. And then you also had hip hop here, specifically the Chicago, well, specifically the hip hop scene throughout the US kind of going into England, and you have the growth of the UK grime scene. So the grime scene in the UK was developed by the children of African and Caribbean immigrants there. Then late 2000s, you have more artists on social media in Africa, and then this is where Chicago comes in. The Chicago drill scene influences the UK version. So you've got drill music kind of emerging in the UK, heavily influenced by Chicago, what happened in Chicago. The 2000s, you have US and UK drill music influencing what is now called Kumerica in Ghana, which is Ghana's own drill scene. So Kumerica is, I'm still trying to figure out how I feel about it, but Kumerica is in Kumasi. So Kumasi is the second largest city in Ghana. And a drill music scene has developed there. And they call that whole hip hop scene community there calls itself Kumerica because of the relationship between Kumasi and Ghana or Kumasi in the United States. And a lot of the neighborhoods are named after US states, not officially, these are the youth. They've got a flag that's very similar to the US flag. And some of the music videos, there's one artist who had him and his friends, they have a video where they're all kind of like waving red bandanas. And it's very reminiscent of the Tekashi video that he did in Brooklyn. And so I'm still drill. I'm still working it out in my head because I remember when they came after our generation for gangster rap and how we felt attacked and misunderstood and not listened to. So I can't do that. So I'm still trying to understand drill. But so you had increased streaming happening. The late 2010s, you have kind of this Afrofuturism emerging throughout the world, just kind of, really films like the Black Panther kind of epitomize the whole Afrofuturism. You have Afrochella coming in the concert in Ghana, the whole Year of Return in 2019. We saw over 1 million people from the diaspora go to Ghana that year, far exceeding Ghana's expectations. Then you have Black Panther and Black is King. And then the last slide. So in conclusion, when you're looking at hip hop in Africa, it's, in the 90s and early 2000s, you really had that hip hop culture in Africa growing with, not that much collaboration with people in the US or, in Europe. Now you're kind of having there's a lot more collaboration, there's a lot more communication. And so I just want to play a couple seconds of Sampa the Great. One of the reasons I want to play her, one, she I think epitomizes, she's an artist who did her undergraduate here in the US, moved to Australia. She spends her time, she's originally from Zambia. She spends her time between Australia and Botswana. And she's actually going to be here at the 9:30 Club on March 29th. That's another reason. I'm like, well, let me play a little bit of Sampa the Great. As you'll see, she mixes in a lot of diaspora and African elements in her music.
My gosh, we raising. Please sympathize all the lies we raising. Please realize all the time. Family energy, drank a couple quarters on my chorus, then I code up. If I rule the world, money stacks for all my daughters. Never asked for payment in the womb ×9. Now we see the blood on the street ×try. Feminine energy, balance up the indestructible in the vaginal. Heaven in thine, heaven is mine. Spiritual, lyrical, mother sang sweetest taboo, rickle kind. If I was astonished by the level of shame, feminine energy reign. Intuition and ambition, intuition shine. Intuition and ambition.
So we're seeing, again, different voices. The UK still, this past summer, there were like 3 different artists, Little Sims, Shabo, and Any. But all 3 dropped really impressive projects this past summer that have been kind of getting a lot of attention. So you're seeing, again, different parts of the diaspora and the continent really influencing each other and kind of throwing each other the ball in terms of music. Yep, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you all so much for those amazing presentations. We definitely want to open the floor for any questions from students who may want to ask to any of you some of the things that you discussed from talking about Afro-Cuba communities and go right here in Washington, D.C., which really connects to this global perspective because Washington, D.C. is a global space. We have people from all over the entire world here. And so very much want to connect that. But I guess I'll start the conversation. There are many themes mentioned in relation to censorship, protest, incarceration, global influence of art, but specifically the way that race and racism plays out in the specific areas, right? In terms of sites of resistance. How do you see that playing out today, right? In the 21st century, even with Fidel Castro, even a part of that speech, he's saying, there are no Afro-Cubans, there are no white Cubans, there's only Cubans. But today we still see the way that books are being talked about that specifically talks about race in Cuba. And so how does race and racism play out in music, art, and culture today as it relates to the way that it perhaps has done in the 90s and 70s? What is that comparison for any of the panelists? And students, if you want to get in line to ask questions, we still have a few minutes.
I think one of the things that you see in the Cuban Revolution and revolutionary Cuba that is always ongoing is even though there are efforts to silence, people always find a way around to express themselves. Anytime you are representative of an identity that doesn't fall within the confines of hegemony, you have no choice but to tell your story, however that may be. And one of the things that I've seen is originally you had writing, and that was the outlet. You touched on language, which is very important, and writing being the official way to tell your story. But when you X people out of writing, you find that film opens up in Cuba. When you start banning people's films, you find that people move to visual arts. And it's an ongoing in music is where you're seeing a lot of protests and resistance in Cuba. That's not to say that writing stopped or visual arts stopped during these other decades, but in Cuba, at least, I find that music is where a lot of the resistance lies, especially because, as you pointed out, with access to YouTube now and WhatsApp, my cousins send me music and digital tracks from Cuba via WhatsApp. So that's how I know what's going on the ground, even though I'm all the way here in DC, right? There's more access, there's more touch points. Social media. Robe El Nino is an artist who has a song called Negro, but it's Negro, Negro. and it's all about hair and Blackness, and it came out recently, but again, I saw him on Instagram, and then I was like, oh wait, we have friends in common, and then we linked on Facebook, and these kinds of things are what I'm seeing now. And the writings that occur, a lot of times it's sometimes from a US perspective, and if you're writing in Cuba, you can't specifically talk about race, but you can approach it via an examination of class, because that's acceptable within a Marxist socialist framework.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello? Okay. What I would just add is I was trying to find, so I don't mess up this word, but we talked about this in my diaspora class. So your question was about recent resistance, but I just think, as I was listening to you talk about, how Black expression finds a way regardless. And I mean, we're so the fact that we're just sitting here and talking to you just shows how strong and resilient that we are. But we've always found space through art and through community and through connection. And I'm trying to find the word, the Portuguese word in João Reis did work on slave rebellions in Bahia, Brazil. Is it Quilombo? Quilombo, am I doing it? Okay, Quilombo. Yeah, so, reading about that was just so inspiring to me, because basically these were resorts, right? During slavery days, people found ways to leave, get some relaxation, get their music and drumming in, and then, go back and face another day. So, these spaces are very powerful. And so, when I see the spaces that, we're in all over the continent and in Cuba and here in DC, even just on a street corner in DC, it just reminds me of this very long, these hundreds of years of resistance that we have been expressed through our music. And we've been creating these spaces, and they're very powerful, and they must be protected.
We do have a question from the audience. Can you say your name, classification, and where you're from?
Hi, my name is Dana, and I'm here with Dr. Wright's class. And I'm from DC. I hope you have my mask down. And I really wanted to speak to Dr. Hopkinson. When you talk about the inequitable distribution of funds for arts, that is something that, to me, really is something that strongly needs to be addressed. But as somebody who lives in one ward, I don't really have a clear understanding of what would create greater equity in funding. And so I was wondering if you could speak to direct actions that people in DC could take to try to encourage that.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. So part of what almost got me thrown off the Arts Commission in DC, and there was an attempt to throw me off by Phil Mendelson, the current chair of the DC Council. My term had expired along with Cora Mastersberry, and he unilaterally decided to not reappoint us because we were troublemakers. And part of what we were doing is that I hadn't done the map yet, but that something is up with the Arts Commission, because I've been writing about arts for 25 years in the city, and very few people who I know ever got funding. So what is happening? So what Cora Mastersberry did was she created an equity task force, and frankly, I was very cynical that it would have any change, because the white supremacy is so ingrained in the way that that commission runs. But we were able to do focus groups. We talked about it. We have 44 recommendations on how to bring equity to arts funding in DC. Right now, they're in the process of being implemented. So even throwing us off wouldn't have helped, because we had already voted on it, had it gone through. But being that we're there, we are trying to systematically dismantle, all of those things. And so, but again, that was before the map. And so the maps it's really important. Like, it's unacceptable, in particular because arts funding in DC is passed through sales tax. So it's a regressive tax. So working class people actually pay more of their income for the arts in this city. And so if you have one ward, and not coincidentally, they're the wards that are closest to the heart of the Confederacy, on the Virginia side. they're taking a lion's share of the funding. I mean, it's unacceptable. So I think the map was really powerful in that it allowed us to give the rest of the council the backbone to overthrow, his word and to sort of defy Phil Mendelssohn and on an emergency vote, keep us on the Arts Commission. But it also has given us some strong marching orders to say, whatever we've been doing, we need to stop doing it and do something else. And so whether that's breaking down the funding by ward and saying, look, here's what ward they get, like do it in some sort of equitable way. But actually equity wouldn't even be saying, okay, sorry, we were doing this, let's just make it all equal now. That's not really what we need to do. Like the equity means we actually need to have greater investments in Ward 7 and 8 and Ward 5 and all these places. And so to answer your question about what you could do and what everyone could do, show up to these meetings. Don't let me and Cort Masters-Berry be the only troublemakers, because it's easy to try to silence a couple people. But if you have everyday people coming in and saying, hey, what about that map? Let's get back to that. Let's not like move past that. We want an answer to how you're going to fix that. So this is why it's really important for people to call in, people to write letters, and people to sort of make the demands to sort of help us do what we do.
Absolutely. And we probably only have time for one more question really quick because it's 11:45 with Mecca.
My name is Mecca. I'm a sophomore here. At first, I just want to say thank you guys for coming and, presenting to us. Thought it was really good. But my question is for the first talker. So is gentrification the leading reason for losing of go-go music or engagement in youth or Black youth here in DC? Because when you showed that clip of the kids dancing, I actually, not in that video, but I remember being at that corner with my siblings.
Are you in the Shaw Community Center?
No.
Okay.
I'm from DC, Southeast DC, born and raised, but it's just like, I saw that video and I was like, my little sister doesn't even know what go-go is. So it's like growing up, but going to, schools and areas that didn't have a lot of Black people. It's like the people I grew with didn't know what go-go was. And I was like, how could you not know? You're from DC. And they're like, what are you talking about? So that's my question. Like, is gentrification, especially in an area like that, leading to less engagement with go-go, or is it also other reasons?
Thank you for the question. It's so important, and the answer is yes. Gentrification is tidily. A lot of the movements in DC have. So the privatization of DC public schools. When you have a neighborhood system that really fed go-go. People would set up bands in their neighborhood. It was very sort of geographically based. That sort of with kids coming all around the city, going to different charters, doing like all of that really has led to like a decline in go-go. Also taking music out of the schools. This is something that was imposed by the control board when Marion Barry was reelected. That has also contributed to like the loss of passing on these traditions. And yeah, your generation doesn't know. I'm always impressed. But as we just heard, there's always a way. People find a way. So, these informal networks, like, okay, you got your postman. That's why I love that little clip. You have your postman teaching these young people, okay, no, this is how you do the hee-haw dance, and so he's sort of taking them through, like, we find a way as a people. And so what I think our task is as citizens, as leaders, as, intellectuals, is to create the structures that make sure that doesn't happen by chance and that happens by intention. And so that's what we're really working on, through my program at Howard, but also the Go-Go Museum Cafe in Anacostia, which should be online pretty soon. We're really trying to get that back. It makes me really happy when I hear young people interested in wanting to learn about it.
Thank you so much. I know many of you still have pending questions, and hopefully our panelists will stick around to answer some student questions. Thank you to our amazing panelists for your presentations. They were so engaging, giving us much to think about. Thank you.